Hi everybody, how you doing? Who's excited to be in like air conditioning and not outside? It's a swamp. I'm really happy to be in a cold basement right now to talk to you about communication. I want to do a little like kind of brass tacks sort of useful sort of tips and tricks that I've learned through some, pain, let's say, over the past like, 5, 10 years of my career. I'm waiting for or maybe I have to do this. Oh, yeah, that's me. Wearing a different hoodie. Here's my title. I originally had the title for this talk called Appraising the Elephant, named after an old, I believe, Indian tale. It's an old parable. It's about 3,000 years old. It's about a group of blind men in a village who hear that the strange beast called an elephant is coming to town. They've never seen it, obviously, being blind men, but they know that they can go out and touch the elephant to try to understand, what the elephant is. So a group of blind men go out to the elephant, approach it, and start to feel around and see what an elephant is. And one of the blind men touches the trunk and says, "Oh, I know what an elephant is. It's a big, thick snake." Another blind man grabs the ear of an elephant and says, "Oh, an elephant is a fan." Another blind man approaches the leg of the elephant and thinks that it's like a trunk or maybe like a pillar supporting a large building. Another man goes and approaches the side of the elephant. It's a wall. And finally, another blind man approaches the tail of the elephant and thinks that it's a rope. Now, it's not a very good story in some ways because it doesn't really have an ending after that point. But there are, to me, like 3 important lessons that I think we can all kind of learn from this parable. One being that it's very hard to understand the world. Each one of us has this tiny little window, into like a world that is like so much bigger than any one of us. And with our limited senses, it's exceptionally difficult to go out there, interact with the world, and try to understand it. And even after we understand it, it's really difficult to share that understanding with other people too. We have really limited tools to be able to communicate with people. Words, drawing, a couple different medium, and to some degree that's about it. Encouraging though, I think that if you imagine the blind men in our tale kind of talking with one another and piecing everything together, they might actually get to some kind of understanding of the world by engaging in dialogue and communicating with each other, that they could actually put the pieces together and understand what this great beast is. So I'm sure, all of you as product people understand that like our many different responsibilities kind of all have communication at their core in one way or another. If you're talking to users and trying to understand what their needs are, what their goals are, what they want from your product, that's a intimate and like vital exercise in communication, asking questions and listening and trying to really achieve understanding what's going on in somebody else's mind. Team discussion, and agreement too, is an incredibly important duty of a product leader to ensure that you have, done a great job of kind of like either putting together your goals for the year, for the quarter, talking about like users' needs and bringing them to your team, and making sure that everybody that you interact with and everybody in the team has that shared understanding so that they can work together and really deliver value. A bunch of other duties that often fall under the responsibility of a product leader too. Communication's at the core of all of it. So I'm only grown more obsessed with this topic as time has gone on. To provide like a quick little model about how I think about communication, and I want to say like as a caveat, there are hundreds of thousands of people who make their lives out of studying communication, whether you're like a linguist or you study like semiotics or literature generally, any kind of media studies. There are, reams and libraries full of information about, thinking about communication, what it means, and how it works. So this is a, scratching the barest of surfaces kind of model for communication. But it's useful, We have 2 people, whether that's two people in a group, two groups of people, just two people talking. And beneath this like hair and bone and blood, they have this concept or idea that's like inside of their brains, right? And between them, there's this gap that you have to bridge somehow with some kind of like media, like the spoken word or the written word, that allows you to try to like take this idea, like a cube here, and actually move it, back and forth between two people having a dialogue until you get, the nirvana of actually having, shared information in two people's heads. In my experience, there are like three places that I spend a lot of time thinking about and focusing on to make sure that good communication is happening in teams that I'm a part of. One is paying a lot of attention to the reciprocal nature of communication. So that means, any great communication is fundamentally some kind of like, back and forth relationship between two parties. And there are a lot of opportunities to make that better, and there are a lot of opportunities for it to break down. And being sensitive to how we can, elevate that relationship makes communication better. Two, we have to use mediums to communicate, right? And most of them are far from perfect, and many of them are fraught with their own kind of challenges, bugaboos, the kind of things that can like introduce confusion and miscommunication when you obviously don't intend to do that sort of thing. And then finally, there's always this context that frames any communication that you're doing. The kind of like history of the past day, the past week, month, year, of things that have happened up to this moment, the emotions that you have, the emotion that people that you're communicating with have. So, introduction aside, I'm going to dive in first with the reciprocity of communication. Again, real simple here, but thinking about it all the time, day after day, hour after hour, keeping it front of mind is an exceptionally useful way to like make sure your communication is better with your team, and make sure that you're always engaging in some kind of like dialogue and going back and forth, right? I think everything coming from this point forward will have some kind of like phrase, as an example of kind of like a tool that I use to make sure that I'm keeping some of this stuff front of mind. So by way of example, one of my favorite techniques to make sure that I'm doing a good job communicating, and again, as being part of like a reciprocal relationship, as a listener, I have to be doing a good job, is giving people their receipts when they are communicating with me. And the example here for me is a simple phrase. It's just, let me play that back to you to make sure that I understand. Kind of like, writing something down longhand, or even just in this example, saying it out loud. There's something about listening to what somebody's saying to you and then reprocessing it, reforging it inside of your own brain that makes understanding and like recall to me, 100 times stronger at least. This is a technique that I use all the time when I'm talking to, especially like my engineering partners. My background is in design, so I'm pretty, well versed in like UX and design and color and type and all this stuff. But when it comes to things like, like the blockchain, for example, or like even simple concepts like extract, transform, and load, or like how does this weird one little thing of JavaScript actually work? Having good teammates that like have the patience to explain to me a concept is great, and then actually just taking that extra moment to kind of like spit it back at them to make sure I really get it, that I've like moved that cube from their mind into my mind for our communication. Exceptionally helpful technique. Simple little thing, but I use it all the time. Another one is to communicate your communication needs. And obviously we're kind of like, talking about communication can kind of fold in on itself. I'm now communicating about communicating your communication needs, which is a fun experience. This one, again, is a simple little tool, but like has made all the difference in my professional life. I remember I used to have a coworker, we'll call him Roger. Roger, isn't his name. But Roger seemed to me like he wasn't very good at communicating, by which I mean, we would have a 5-alarm fire going on. The site was down for hours on end, let's say, right? And I'm on Slack trying to get Roger's attention, trying to get Roger to help me out. And I never got through to him. And this happened a couple times, and I was always like, geez, like, what's wrong with Roger? Why does he want to help? Like, he knows that the site's down, we have some trouble. Until finally we're kind of talking about it, and I mentioned like, hey, Roger, sometimes I can't get you. He mentioned to me that he hates Slack, actually. And he really prefers phone calls. And like this giant light bulb went off in my head, and I realized that I had been doing a bad job, and I could have just done something as simple as asking Roger, hey, in the moment, what's the best way to reach you? And sure enough, a couple weeks later, we had some trouble. I called Roger on the phone, and we had an incredible conversation for 5 minutes, addressed all the issues. I got a better understanding from him about the nature of the bug than I could have over Slack. So asking people how they like to communicate and being clear about how you like to communicate too. What time of day that you like to be available, what time of day you like to go heads down and work. What kind of medium do you like? Do you like emails? Some people like emails. Some people like to have a full inbox. I don't know. Some people like Slack. Product manager, I love Slack because like all the time I've got access to my whole team. I can get all the information I need in a moment's notice. If your head's down deep in some like Python code or something, an engineer does not want to be interrupted. If you're in the middle of doing some wireframes, a designer does not want to be interrupted. So being clear about like when and how to communicate, which only takes like 5 minutes tops to send out a survey to your team, can mean this massive difference, in the future about, how you communicate as a team and communicating more effectively. I'm a big fan of talking one-on-one with people, sitting down over coffee or a beer, just like going aside can make the difference in like getting to the heart of a problem sometimes. I'm not like advocating that anybody, gossip or like try to get people to backtalk. Like that is a terrible, horrible, no good thing to do for your team. But just, talking to someone one-on-one as a person, this like, social pressure that happens when there's a group of 3 or more evaporates, and you can really just look someone in the eye, understand what they're saying, know how they're thinking about the world, and then you can do a better job of framing how you're thinking about the world and get that, communication gap closed. Another interesting technique that I've learned over the time of my years being a product manager is being like open and vulnerable, and always kind of like being the first one who does that and demonstrates that kind of practice to your team. This is a technique that actually stealing completely from our old head of product. His name's David. He wouldn't have to say this too often, but David was never shy about saying, I was wrong, or I don't know, And I was always impressed how being open like that didn't reduce his standing as a leader for the team, but in fact it elevated it because it, helped uncork this kind of like pressure to be right inside of the team, and everybody who kind of was confused was able to admit that maybe they were confused, which is a better way of like identifying what you need to go learn as a team. It also helps some people who maybe felt like they didn't have the space to share. They have now the opportunity to kind of say, well, actually, I know this, or I've got an idea here. It feels, like, especially if you're like a product leader, that you have to have all the answers all the time. And, to be fair, you cannot come in front of your team every day and say you were wrong. That's going to be a problem. But like in the rare opportunities, I'm sure that we're all imperfect, which happens like once every 5 or 6 years, I'm sure. It's good to be open and vulnerable about it. Another important thing when it comes to communication is to make sure that you're walking a mile in everybody's shoes. And there's obviously like a difference between like sympathy and understanding people you work with, and then real empathy and having like gone through something that they're doing and feeling what they're feeling. And to have this experience is, again, really not something that takes more than maybe an hour in some cases, whether it's sitting next to your customer experience team and answering a couple tickets with them, whether it's sitting down with a designer and having them kind of like show you something new they learned in Sketch, or show them some frustration that they've had with some tool, whether it's dabbling in JavaScript or some other like computer language like I do on the side, so that I really understand the kind of like both the pain that an engineer will go through sometimes, and also like the pleasure she'll have when she's solved something in an elegant, efficient way. Being able to connect with people, by having at least some shared basis with them, hugely important for like good communication. Understanding again like how they see the world and being able to frame how you see the world and get that dialogue going. After that, then let's talk about mediums a little bit. So it's actually, depending on your perspective, kind of like just a small miracle, maybe a huge miracle that, over millions and billions of years, a couple of these mammals on this planet have somehow evolved this kind of like tool to be able to do what I'm doing right now, is make sounds and gestures in front of a group or just one person and actually share some kind of ideas. Like, it's ridiculous. And then you also like step back and thinking about how English or other language work and how many like grammatical pitfalls there are, like there, and there, for example. It's not a very elegantly designed tool. So it often gets in the way, and being thoughtful and sensitive about that, I found has made my ability to communicate with a team a lot better. So by way of example, being sensitive about how mediums you use kind of like strip meaning away sometimes can be really helpful for understanding, especially sometimes when conflict comes up, right? Or why people don't understand. There's a study done back in the 60s by a psychologist with some college kids. And the thrust of the study was to understand how much of communication was verbal, how much was based on like tone of voice, and how much is based on body language, whether it's like facial expression or gesture and that sort of thing. And turned out 7% of communication was actually coming through words, 38% was coming through tone of voice, and fully 55% really came more for like eye contact and gesture and that sort of thing. Now, it's one study, and those are very precise percentages, so your usage may vary, but it's an eye-opening kind of perspective on how much like words are not that good at communicating, and things like tone of voice and gesture carry communication. And for me, this always helps me understand why like an email gets misinterpreted, or why Slack can be so stressful for some people, and why a phone call is often better, and why face-to-face communication is really like the superior form of communication, because it has a lot higher bandwidth than something like Slack or email. So I've always found that like being the person, the minute like things start to percolate, whether it's like tension or some kind of confusion or even excitement, being the person who says, let's get on a phone call, let's talk about it, let's sit down face to face, let's get out of Slack, don't you dare email about that bug to that person, Trying to prioritize the high bandwidth forms of communication, super helpful for the team. And again, like modeling that kind of behavior gets everybody kind of on the same page. And I also very sensitive to the fact that language kind of sucks. And again, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here to say the word sucks because it's not a great word, but it does explain what I mean. Language is really inelegant and imprecise. And by way of example, I'm going to ask all of you to think of an elephant inside of your head, right? And everybody probably has a similar kind of like idea of a gray, large beast inside of their head, right? We all have a kind of shared understanding of what an elephant is. Everybody might have a different memory right now, or some kind of like specific image, whether it's like, like an elephant like blowing some water up, or that time they went to Thailand and took a ride on back an elephant. I'm not sure, But there are words that are a lot less precise and can get really confusing if you're not specific about them. In all our lives, like love, for example, can mean very different things to different people. If I say the word love, some of you are probably thinking about the idea of like familial love, like your mother, your father, brother, sister, what have you. Some of you are probably thinking more like romantic love, right? When it comes to our like professional duties, think about the word success, and what that word might mean for your team. Like if you're not clear about what success means and what success means for your whole team, everybody probably is going to have a very different idea of what that means. It might be specific to their domain. It might be kind of like an idea of where they think the company should go, but they're not really talking or thinking about that with anybody else. So I often find myself kind of saying, this isn't exactly the right word, like especially when a word is kind of loaded, like failure, let's say. It's a powerful word. It's something, if you're taking risk, you're going to do, but it can really hurt people, that word. And diving into words and trying to carve away sometimes what they shouldn't mean or you don't mean them to mean, really helpful thing to do. I'm going to beat up now on some language. There are some elements that I strive to never use. TLAs, which are three-letter acronyms, which is a three-letter acronym in and of itself. Pronouns and jargon are, to me, just the devil. There are some cases when they're helpful to be used, especially like when people inside of a domain like design want to just communicate quickly. Using acronyms is fine, using jargon is fine. But when it comes to cross-functional communication, which is, the meat and potatoes of really working together as a team, be careful, using jargon like EOD. Probably most of us maybe at this point know what end of day is as an acronym, but I remember the first couple times I saw like EOD or COB, and it made me feel really ignorant. It didn't help me communicate with somebody else about what was happening. It's this like tick that kind of actually helps obfuscate, somebody's meaning and throws people off a little bit. It's not that much harder to type out end of day, so I always type out end of day. Kind of like jargon, like circle back. You can usually divine through context what people mean with it, but it just kind of sounds icky to me. Like it's corporate speak. Not everybody's always thrilled to hear it. And it's, doesn't really clear about what you mean. Like if all you want to say is, let's discuss it again later, I like to say, let's discuss it again later. And then finally, in this example, bad sentence, grab him, right? Who's him? I don't know. I'm never going to know because it just says him. And I mean this mostly for myself. I frequently kind of feel like the character from Christopher Nolan's movie Memento, if anybody's seen it. A man has no long-term memory whatsoever and tattoos notes to himself on his body to remember what he's up to in the film. And I would run out of room pretty quickly. I only have one body, so I like to use specific nouns as much as possible because it's clear not just for the person I'm communicating with, but even more so for future Carl, remembering what I was talking about, even like 10 minutes from now. And speaking of taking notes, take notes. Taking notes to me is one of the most powerful things that you can do as a product leader by facilitating conversation, bringing people together, sitting behind the computer, and writing down what everybody says. Again, the payoff here is kind of to your future self because you have a record of the communication that already happened, and now you can avoid kind of rehashing things in the future that people have already talked about. Finally, in this topic is not being afraid to repeat yourself. So I remember when I first started as a product manager, and let's say that I had a big presentation about like our quarterly goals, right? I spoke to everybody on the team, did a great job synthesizing what was going on for the team and the business and the metrics, put together a killer presentation, delivered it in a Monday morning meeting. People loved it, felt so good about myself. Having lunch with a coworker the next day, getting some feedback about the presentation, right? And I asked, we'll call her Ashley, if she remembered, kind of the content, oh yeah, so what do you think about the second goal I talked about? She couldn't recall it. And it was like stab, right in the heart for me that, somebody hadn't heard what I said. And I thought I did such a good job explaining it. And, for months, right, this kind of was a personal thing almost for me, and it shouldn't be, obviously, but it hurt my feelings, when I would, say something to the team about our goals for the quarter. The next day, somebody would forget it, and I'd say it again, and they'd forget it, and I'd say it again, and they'd forget it. And over time, I learned really what this is about is when it comes to important stuff, it's good to help repeat it for the team because people are really busy and they have thousands of things going on. And it's actually really helpful for you to just patiently keep saying some things, especially priority things like your goals, for the quarter, let's say, over and over and over again. It's not annoying, and when people forget, it's not personal either. Repeating and repeating and repeating is, for me, kind of like the key to communication. Finally, a few words on context, which, unfortunately we can't escape it, but it's also really helpful, right? There's always going to be some kind of history or emotions that are going on in the world around you, and you have to be sensitive to them because they will add some new signals to whatever just base communication that you're trying to send out. And I'll give it a little example, right? As an innocuous question, how's that presentation coming along? At its surface is a simple question about the status of a presentation, right? But depending on context, this could mean something really different. If I'm excited about a presentation that Roger was working on, I'd say, Roger, hey, how's that presentation coming along? The context of my relationship with Roger, my excitement for the project he's working on, my desire to maybe even contribute to it. It's kind of like context that frames this phrase and means something totally different. It's something positive here. Or let's say Roger's working a presentation and I as a manager, I'm a little concerned about his performance or something, and I'm asking, hey Roger, how's the presentation coming along? Trying to letting my emotions leak out a little bit too much. And this is actually more like stopping by and kind of prodding somebody a little bit. The context here means a lot, and it means it adds this extra dimension to something that should be, again, pretty simple sentence, right? So 2 tips here, right? One is considering how people are going to interpret what you say. Again, this is brass tack stuff. You might also phrase this as, think before you speak. I have, over years and years of work and pain, kind of developed a little algorithm inside my brain that's always trying to analyze what I'm saying and making sure what I'm saying makes sense and thinking about how people are going to interpret it and seeing if they do interpret it how I mean to share it. And if I catch myself, oh, I know I'm going to need to add some clarity here, being thoughtful about how people interpret what you say. Again, this is, again, brass tack stuff, but again, applied over and over again, really important to good communication. And then finally, when it comes to context, it can be really helpful to just get it out there. This is another phrase I learned and I love to employ all the time, is just let's make the implicit explicit. It's a really helpful way to start a meeting sometimes and make sure that all the assumptions you think everybody shares in the room, everybody shares them. Every time I've used this or seen somebody use this in a meeting, I found out that somebody on the team had different assumptions in some way. And getting that clarity up front pays dividends in avoiding kind of confusing communication along the way. So even if it can feel cumbersome or even a bit of an insult to some degree, right, by just spelling some things out when you're in a group situation or a communication situation, even if it feels awkward, it has a lot of payoff because you never know really what's inside somebody's head. So with that, that's all I've got on communication. Again, hopefully we've got a couple new phrases to think about deploying when you're communicating with your teams. Thanks for your time.